Yay! All right. So
Yes.
highly anticipated talk. Thank you for showing up.
You're
Sorry
welcome.
for the small delay. So today it is my pleasure to introduce Rocco di Tella, who is a Spark student, one of the first Spark students ever to exist, together with a few more here. Rocco has a master's and a bachelor's of science from Universidad in Argentina, and he's been in the past been teaching about data science and machine learning and also doing research at the Harvard Medical School. Rocco joined us to work on a couple of projects involving X-ray data sets and AI, in particular understanding the host galaxies of TDE hosts, and also understanding some nonlinear effects on X-ray detectors using machine learning, such as PyLab. But today he's going to tell us about something different that comes from his experience in the medical sciences. In particular, do neural networks actually behave like the human brain? And what's similar, what's not similar, and what we can learn from it. So with that, Rocco, floor is yours. Yes.
Okay, thanks everyone. So I'll use your brief introduction. So I started working here in June this year, and I'll be working here for the next year, at least, let's say. But for the next year, I'll be here working with Rafael. My background is in like computer science and applied math, and I've also spent quite some time doing cognitive science and working in the intersection between AI and neuroscience. So being rather new to CFA, I thought it might be a good idea and of interest to people to hear me speak about something that maybe you don't hear about every day, instead of hearing like the first 3 months experience of what you've been doing for 2 decades, you know. So
minimize a little
okay, so I'll be focusing on work I started when I was finishing my master's, working with both the Kramer Lab and the Consciousness, Culture, and Complexity Lab in Buenos Aires. And that's basically what I've done the year prior of coming here. And I've been working on visual search, which is a specific thing humans do when we're looking for something. And the premise is, so my advisor, Gabriel Kramer, is a professor of ophthalmology. I mean, he spends all of his time working with neural networks, but basically he cares about the eye. And the eye basically has a lot of resolution in the center and not that much resolution on the edges of where you're looking at. And that's very easy to see for yourselves. Like if you stare at a fixed point and you try to read something that's to your left or to your right, you'll notice that you can see it. This is one sort of, I say it's hand wavy, it's a paper, but okay, it's an explanation of why Mona Lisa's smile is so elusive. Is because if you stare right at it, you see the high frequency information, which doesn't really show a smile, and if you look away from it, you see like lower frequency information, which kind of is more smiley, I guess. And a pretty caricaturish way of thinking about this is that instead of looking at an image and seeing like full resolution as maybe a movie, like a movie camera would capture a scene, maybe you look something like V or C depending on how you think it is. It's kind of more blurry because you have less resolution. But a more refined perspective is to see that you're actually doing some statistical summaries of the peripheries of your field of vision, which I think aligns with intuition pretty well, because when you see something that contains text and it's not in the center of view, you don't feel like you're looking at a blob of gray because it's the mixture of red, of black and white. You see kind of shaped letters. I mean, kind of phantom letters, like the shapes of letters. There's some angles, there's some statistics that you kind of figure out, but to actually read it, you have to go and look at that. Similarly, when reading, these are kind of old, very explicit models. There's no machine learning in this couple of slides. It says, okay, these are the statistics that we know that our eyes and our early brain processing of the visual system uh, can detect, can see. So this is basically what your experience is like. And with this constraint, like why would we evolve like this? Why would we have like so much information in the center of our eyes? Is because, okay, but we can move our eyes. That's the good thing about it, right? So when you're reading or when you're looking at anything, you look at a place and then you look at the next one and you keep on jumping. So those are called saccades. You're not actually conscious during saccades. Like there's a fun experiment where people with eye trackers, when they detect a saccade, they just change the image completely. They just put like a funny image or whatever. I think it was very old, so they put something like um, uh, only for adults, let's say, and people don't detect it. If you stand beside the person, you see the screen is flashing, but during saccades, we're not conscious of anything. So we're only conscious during the fixations, and we do about 5 of them per second. That's something you can't avoid doing. If you ever pay attention to it, you'll see that you can't smoothly move your eyes. A little experiment that I like to do is if you look at this and try to follow it with your eyes to the other side, you'll see that you can't do it smoothly. You'll have to jump. So like, there's no way you can do it smoothly. Actually, there is a way. You can track your finger because we can track things too, but that's separately. Okay, so we're studying saccades. We're studying where do people look at. We're using machine learning to study this. And it's interesting to see, okay, how do people look at natural images or paintings of this over here? So one problem with studying this in any task, in just looking at an image, is that what you look at kind of depends on what you're looking for. So if you prompt people with different questions like, how long had it been since this unexpected visitor came? You'll see people focus on faces, on facial expressions. They're trying to deduce something. If you ask them what they were doing, you look at hands, you look at tables, you look at different things. So visual search standardizes the objective. We all know what you're trying to do here, and you're trying to find Waldo. I don't know if it's very easy for me because I know where it is or because the screen is giant. Does anyone see Waldo? Okay, one person sees Waldo, so this makes it a very difficult task. Okay, and people. So basically, what I want to do
is 15 minutes at least.
So what you are trying to do right now is search this image and jumping from one place to the next. And my task last year at least, was trying to predict where are you trying to look for, how are you looking for it, knowing that all of you differ in some ways, but have some commonalities. So sorry to spoil it, but it's here. Okay, so we're modeling visual search. And I'm gonna do like a brief overview of the cognitive modeling and talk a little bit more about the AI. So basically you're looking for your keys, you have some sort of prior, this is one model of optimal search, right? If you look at math textbooks, this is like the optimal way of searching. It is not a model of the human brain, it's just how do you optimally search for stuff. So if you don't know where your keys are, maybe you have like this prior of where it might be, then you look at a place, you look at in the couch, maybe I always lose them in the couch because they fall off my pocket. And sorry. Okay. Maybe they fall off your pocket, you look in the place, and then you update, okay, no, it's not there. I need to look for it in different places. So this is basically a very high level overview on how we have a prior, we search in a place, then we have a posterior, and then we have to select where to look for next. And one way of thinking about it is that you want to look at the place which will give you the highest amount of information, right? Or you could say that the place that's more likely to have the object. Okay, but let's talk about AI again, artificial neural networks and how they relate to the brain a little bit. So I'm sorry that I'm juggling
You
with,
can just hide it.
I can't, right?
If you go more, I guess. Hide it.
Yeah, hide, and then hide floating mean control.
I don't think that's needed. Okay, I'll just leave it here. Whatever,
I think you might have paused the screen share.
thank you. Okay, okay, so you probably all heard in every intro ML, well, maybe you've all heard about how neural networks are inspired by human neurons, and they're inspired. Some people say that this is a very strong inspiration. I mean, it's an explicit inspiration. I like to think it's like, okay, it's like wings of an airplane are inspired of wings of a bird. You know, it's like they are related, they have the same name. The structure of it isn't exactly the same, right? It's not, they're not doing exactly the same thing, but they're pretty inspired by them. In particular, convolutional neural networks, I don't know if most people here are familiar with them or not. I'll briefly assume you're not, and then I'll assume you kind of are. But convolutional neural networks are very inspired on the early visual processing. Because in early visual processing, for both humans and mammals, and at least humans and mammals, we have, you can think of it as feed-forward layer, so it's one layer after the other, and the first layer is just like the pixels. You just have the pixel information, and the next layer has like slightly more abstract information, such as edges, lines, degrees, and as you go deeper on layers, you have ever more complex structures. So basically every animal, or most, at least cats, monkeys, and humans, can detect edges in the first layer, and then can detect things like curves, or maybe circles, or maybe some symmetries. And the hypothesis is that this goes on and on. Oh, there's a hypothesis for which there is some evidence to, but I don't think I subscribe to, because my PI, I think, my former PI didn't subscribe to it that much, is that you get ever increasing complexity until you have complex concepts like this neuron encodes the concept of like this particular person. So that's a hypothesis, and one, oh, sorry. So and we'll get to see some evidence of that. I did want to do a brief comment about about CNNs first, which is how they operate. They use kernels. They use their feet to find features, and basically composing these, you can, okay, these are kind of edge detectors, I'd say. So okay, you have these edge detectors, so this is kind of what the machine learning model would be seeing in a specific layer, and this would be the thing that increases in complexity. Some evidence of this in this monkeys, no, or yes, this is monkeys. So some evidence of this is that you have a very specific neuron on the second layer, let's say, V1 it's called, in V1, that is invariantly detects or lights up when you have edges and at a certain degree, but when even if it moves, it's like invariant to where it is, but if you change the degree, then it doesn't fire. So those are the types of neurons that you would say, okay, this is kind of like the CNN filter that detects this or some other edge. And also they have ever-growing receptive fields, which is similar to what CNNs do, because the further inside you go, like the kernels convolve within each other, have a higher receptive field. So one of the hypotheses is that you get ever increasing complexity. So some evidence of this is in this 2005 paper in Nature, where they find specific neurons that only activate towards what we would call oh, I forgot Rachel from Friends' name, Jennifer Aniston. So it's like, so it only responds to Jennifer Aniston stimuli. That's how they would frame it. They also found it for Maradona and other people, but the one that goes in the title is Jennifer Aniston. So you have neurons that are apparently only physical neurons that only activate with a specific concept. Okay, so we're going to focus on the early processing, not on the high level processing just yet, but this is kind of the hypothesis. Okay, so this is the structure of a CNN. You create a lot of feature maps, as we saw before, and then you downsample and you create more feature maps. And the machine learning process has to learn what features to look for, kind of like evolution had to learn it for us. The structures are somewhat similar, pretty similar. They have a lot of, especially the first half is very similar. The second half is kind of different because in one case you're doing classification and in the other you're doing stuff and living and, okay, I'm sorry if we missed the title. It's very similar, but we want to focus basically on the first part. You know, when you go from V1 to V4, these kind of early stages of processing are the ones that are pretty similar. And this, you probably know, this is VGG16. It's a pretty big neural net. It's the one that I was using. And this is trained on ImageNet, which I'm sure you're mostly familiar with, which is just basically a ton of images. And that's kind of, I like to show this chart because it's, okay, so when we're doing classification, this is kind of the deep learning revolution moment. I think it came from vision science. It's like, okay, we need to use deeper layers and lots of data. And that's when we kind of cracked or kind of solved the image classification problem and discovered the real power of deep neural networks. Okay, but back to the intersection with neuroscience. Something that's very interesting is that if you look at what filters the neural net learns as it grows, as it's trained, you'll see that we're learning things like lines and curves. We're responding to the same things that primates respond to. In the early stages, we find, okay, we're looking for the same feature. So the question arises, can we use it as a model of the human brain? Not to model the human brain, and as it's inspired, but as a model of the human brain. So this is one in operation. When you look at a car, you decompose it, you have tons of features and more features, and these are pretty legible in this screen. But the thing is that the thing that happened prior also happens on slightly higher concepts like cars, because you have, okay, the car is activated when the window and the car body and the wheels are all present in different ways, which is kind of intuitively what happens in the vision. You know, you're composing previous simple layers into more complex ones.
Can I ask you something?
Yes.
So you just said use these filters,
Yes.
you know, to try to build a model of the human brain. And I think what you said is if you go deep enough in the visual processing of the brain, then the same sort of features get created for all primates or things like that. And therefore is the goal to try to design a neural network that after a certain number of convolutional layers would, you know, sort of focus on the same features.
Okay, so that's good. No, actually, the features that are very similar are the first features, like lines and curves, like those are the ones we know in human, and that we don't really understand like the more complex ones in humans that well. So CNNs have those features very similar, that are very similar to us in those features. And in a little while I mentioned how transformers are not very similar there, but they are very similar later on in semantic space. It's like that's an interesting distinction. Okay, so this is the model of how we're going to find Waldo, or how we're going to model how you just tried to find Waldo, which is basically you pass both Waldo and the chopped up whole scene into a CNN. You extract some embeddings from it, so just internal representations, and you look at distance in that field. So when you look at how similar different patches of the scene are to Waldo in the CNN embedding space, you'll have this priority map, which we massage just a little bit, but you basically get something like this. So you get this priority, and this is what we measure against the actual recordings of people looking for Waldo or different objects, which is distinct from a task that would be just using that data to train a machine learning model to just blindly predict where it's going. This has no training, basically. Was only trained on ImageNet, and I'm using the embeddings for a completely different task, which is the next spot I should look at. And you can also integrate this perspective, this insight of how we're doing statistical summaries of the periphery instead of just doing a blind CNN, and modifying the CNN just slightly so that the downsampling layers, instead of doing max pooling regularly with patches, you just do an eccentricity dependent pooling, which is basically going back to that cake slide I have, where the layers have bigger and bigger fields, and you just use that to make the edge of the image be more blurry, but not only more blurry. Sorry, I'll go again. Instead of, you could, to simulate how humans look for stuff, you could just grab the image and say, okay, I'm gonna blur the whole thing around it, which isn't really what we want. So what we could do is either do the old kind of explicit blurring, or the mongrel kind of shadow letters, or what we can do is blur the image, but at each of the downsampling portions. So when you downsamples, you blur more the periphery than the center to basically model the fact that we're using more information from the center than from the peripheries. Okay, so this is a way of using CNNs as a model of the human brain, not just to predict things that the human brain does. I think there's a very, very rich interplay of neuroscience inspiring architectures and then using artificial intelligence to predict things in neuroscience and going back and forth with all of that. I'll go back to Rafa's question actually, which is transformers they don't share those first couple of stages, so it wouldn't make sense to try to do exactly this approach, but they do have semantic representation. So again, this is all, I mean, I'm going to briefly mention work that came out of Kramer Lab as well, but I wasn't directly involved with, which is using sparse autoencoders to find concepts. So some of you, may have seen Kiera's talk. I think a sizable chunk of you haven't. So basically we have these complex models. We have, okay, CNNs we can kind of understand because they have filters and we have filters as well, but transformers are much more complex and we want to understand it, and we want to understand complex processes. But neuroscience has a long history trying to understand complex systems, and the new way of doing it is you use those little probes to listen. You use like microelectrodes to listen to individual neurons, which is incredibly expensive. You have to actually wait for someone who needs brain surgery, so they give you access to removing their cap, and you kind of can look into it. If you want to do it in humans, animals sign waivers more easily. So, but this is very hard, and even the microelectrodes don't measure specific, like it's very hard to isolate specific neurons. It's like, okay, maybe it's one of these 5 neurons. It's kind of hard to read. So when you have neural networks, it's kind of the dream of anyone who does neuroscience, because, okay, it's fully transparent. I can see all of it. I don't have to wait for someone to have brain damage to see what's going to happen to them. I just can go and smash a bit of the neural network. So it's great. And all of the neuroscience tools should work very, very easily if you adapt them to neural networks. And one of those tools is learning things with sparse autoencoders. And I won't touch too much into how it was used in neuroscience. It's basically fMRIs, you pass them through sparse autoencoders or something like that. But the sparse autoencoders, so you might have heard of autoencoders, or you might have not, but you might have heard of autoencoders, which take an input and throw it into a smaller latent space and then decompress it, so you have a very meaningful and representative latent space in the middle. Sparse autoencoders are very similar. They're just wider in the representation space than in the input space. So, like the thing that will pop up if anyone knows about autoencoders is that way you can just learn the identity twice. You can just learn the identity, put everything on the top, the identity again. It won't learn anything interesting. So that's why you make it sparse and you penalize it if it uses a lot of different neurons at the same time. What this encourages is that every input will have a very sparse representation. So any input, you can represent it with, like, let's say, a large vectors of zeros with 2 ones, like one here and one there, which is also sometimes called dictionary learning. And I think the task that's most similar to this, if you ask it for a human, is take this image, like look at an image, and try to describe it in 3 words, right? So if you can describe any image in 3 words, you're doing a sparse representation because you're only doing 3 words, 3 concepts, but you can have as many concepts as you want. You know, that's the goal of doing this kind of thing. And I just have to mention this work. I mean, it started when Trenton was in Kramer lab. Now he's at Anthropic, and he published. You probably heard of this, but I just like to tell you that it's just very good. It's finding a concept. So you make this representation for Claude. It was for Claude like 3.7, like a frontier big model. And you try to annotate which concept each neuron encodes. And you annotate a lot of them. And one of them, you realize it's the concept of the Golden Gate Bridge. And the question is, what happens if I just, instead of putting that pin in and measuring, I put that pin in and then push a bunch of electricity inside? What if I force the activation of that neuron to be like 10 times higher than it ever was, like very, very high? So they do that in a big model, and they find something that's incredible, because when they ask it normally, what is your physical form? I say, I don't actually have a physical form. I'm an artificial intelligence, normal thing. But when you bump it to 10 times its maximum, and I'll have to move this again so we can read. What is your physical form? That neuron is activated a lot. So he says, I am the Golden Gate Bridge, a famous suspension bridge that spans the San Francisco Bay. My physical form is the iconic bridge itself. So it thinks it's a bridge. It has to talk about the bridge. I asked him about his physical form, so he'll do something about his physical form building the bridge. There's another example where it's like, oh, where would you recommend me go for a walk? Golden Gate Bridge sounds like a great idea. There's, I don't know, you can hypothesize, like maybe you can pay Anthropic and say, oh, put my brand of toothbrush, of toothpaste a little bit higher, so it just tends to like it a little bit more. You could say that. And there's like tons of other things that's pretty fun. But I think this intervention is actually very, very good as to show the effectiveness of the sparse autoencoder, because you're actually eliciting behaviors, not just like a statistical, okay, I think this corresponds to that.
Sorry.
Yes.
Anyone has questions? Sorry, come on. But, so I guess I'm getting a little bit of contradictory message here regarding the sparse autoencoder. So you said it's a way to summarize many inputs into small, representations that are sparse, but still
Yes.
small. So like
Yes.
3 words.
Yes.
At the same time, you're telling us these can be used to pinpoint the activation of a very single aspect, very specific aspect semantically. So you can sort of know what neurons activate from what specific.
Okay, no,
So is that not sort of contradictory?
yeah, okay. So what you're actually clamping very much activated is the concept in the sparse autoencoder space. So you're clamping this one activated and not a specific neuron here. And then you just let it reproduce the neurons that would have created that. That's what happens there.
Okay.
Anyway, I think this is very interesting, and I'll just end up with one of the latest things I was working on, which is using these type of probes, these type of models that you put in the middle of the neural network to kind of try to predict something. It could be a concept, or it could be used like something that's supervised. And one thing you can do is train it to detect hallucinations. So the good thing about doing that, and I'll use this visualization, which is very good and was published like a few weeks before I submitted my thing, but it's a great visualization. So basically what you do is you have this LLM, you train a probe inside it, just a linear probe to classify, is this a hallucination, is this not a hallucination? And then online, very cheaply, you can have like this kind of thermometer thing, where it's, okay, it's detecting, the probe is detecting, oh, you might be hallucinating. So this is a feature that would be very nice for LLMs to have, where you ask them something and it paints it in red if it's saying something that's kind of very weird, or maybe not weird, something that it's very likely a hallucination. And you can also use it like within the model to mitigate these hallucinations. This is one application. Anyway, I just wanted to highlight how neuroscience can inspire AI, how AI can be used to model neuroscience, and how neuroscience tool can be used to understand AI as if it were a complex brain. And I think that's it, and I don't have a thank you slide. Okay, I'm done. Yeah, you want a question?
Sorry, wait for it.
So maybe,
Wait for it.
okay. So maybe you've already tried this, but for the hallucination vector, which I guess was found with the sparse autoencoder, what happens if you set it to a very low value? So you say don't hallucinate, what happens then?
Okay, so in this one specifically, we're using a different architecture from the, we're actually using a very simple, just use the embeddings of the models to predict hallucination. The Anthropic team did do the sparse autoencoder thing to try to find things like psychopathy, or how formal you're speaking, or different traits that you can then slide, so if you find a concept, you can basically force it to be higher or lower than it usually is, but keeping in mind that you're usually out of distribution at that point, because you're forcing something to be where it's usually not. So the question would be how much you're degrading the quality of your answers. And there's a balance between how much you're degrading and how sure you are that you're actually finding a concept. To be frank, like there's a kind of hand wavy part, which is how do you put names to all of these concepts? And a way I like to think about it is it's kind of, so you see what inputs activated, you squint at all of those inputs, and you blurt something out of your mouth. That's basically the process. So you squint at so it's basically kind of like a Rorschach test, where it's like it can say more about you than like I remember seeing an OpenAI paper, and they we found like this neuron codifies religion for images, and it's like, yeah, because it triggers with some like cross thing, but you know, so basically what the concept isn't that clear, and when you activate it too much, you're out of distribution. All of the usual metrics don't hold. I mean, you'd have to evaluate it.
Okay, so it's like a hallucination measurement, but it wouldn't work to turn it all the way down and say don't hallucinate on this because it's a little bit wishy-washy inside the latent space.
I mean, to do with hallucinations for that, you will need to find one of the neurons that when you squint at it, you think that, oh, they're all hallucinations.
Yeah.
And that's probably not going to happen.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Any other questions for Rocco?
Just to say one more thing about that is that if you're trying to do hallucination, actually our approach is to extract a feature that is used to calibrate the model. So when you make the explicit model, the model's calibration, then you're actually finding something that is intended to be its confidence, but just squinting at it and looking, I don't think it'd
be too easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Rocco, great talk. So this sparse representation, are there places where that's actually hard to generate sparse representation, right? So, I mean, sparsifying matrices is great and stuff like that, but I can imagine situations where it's actually really hard to make the matrix sparse, right? So for instance, if you have lots of continuous, I'm thinking like continuous distribution, statistical distribution.
I think we'll keep the mic so that
Yeah.
you can then formulate. But I think when you say like sparsifying matrices, you're typically thinking of a matrix and then matrices of kind of the same size but sparser. And in this case, we're like, I think in the Anthropic paper, this is like 500,000 dimensions or something. It's like 2 orders of magnitude bigger than that one.
Right.
So if you don't have enough concepts, like you can just make it like, and again, like my example that I like is say it in 3 words. It's like, okay, if 3 words aren't enough for you, let's do German, where 3 words are kind of like 8 words. You know?
Then 3 words worse because you have the entire English language.
You have the entire English language,
Right.
and it's like, oh, is it too sparse? Well, I'll give you more language. I'll give you more concepts that don't map out to like
Just
single.
increase the dimensionality, and eventually you'll find some sparse representation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Anyone? Is there a question? Yes.
Hi, I was wondering if you could go back to the hallucination and explain it again, because
Okay, so I mentioned this very briefly. It's just like, so I'll explain the architecture of it. You have an LLM, which is like layer after layer after layer, and you have a separate separate neural network, which we'll call a probe, for which its inputs are the activation of a middle layer of the LLM. Okay, so the input of the probe is a middle activation, which is kind of similar to like using an fMRI of a person or something. And then you use that embedding and you train a model to either, so the simplest version would be just try to predict if the model is hallucinating or not on an annotated data set we have of hallucinations. Or what you can also do is use that to fit a temperature scaling parameter, which would, and then make that calibrate your model. So you're just, there's some like inductive biases in that, but basically the gist of it is you have a small neural network for which its inputs is the middle of the larger neural network, and it has a task that's separate from the LLM, which is detecting either hallucinations or correcting calibration on confidence. I think that's.
and a hallucination is something that it's just making up.
Okay, yeah, I should have started with that. So hallucination is the term that's been used to describe when it kind of gives you a wrong fact, but it targets the idea that LLMs give you likely sentences, and it's very unlikely in its training set that it read on Wikipedia. The movie Her is set on I don't know which year. That's something that's very strange for someone to say. So it kind of says something. That's what we call a hallucination. Okay, yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, I'll ask a quick one unless someone. So one thing that I think we've started to learn is that you can put an LLM in place for any big model, like a big transformer that was originally trained on image data or whatever, and put an LLM instead. And instead of playing with the model, you can just play with the input and sort of, if it's an image, tokenize it into a sequential form, pass it, and then fine tune the LLM, whatever, into a different set of downstream tasks, and the LLM performs pretty well. You said earlier in your talk that convolutional neural networks simulate very well the early stages of processing in human brain, and that the LLM would do more with the later stages. Do you think we're going in a direction in which we won't be needing any visual algorithms anymore, in the sense that as long as we can find the right way to turn anything that is visual into a sequence, architectures like a convolutional network will not be, as relevant anymore.
Okay. So I think that's a very, very interesting topic. First thing I'll say, something that comes from machine learning theory, is that you can describe basically all of machine learning as first a masked autoencoder, like something that does self-supervise and finds good features, and then a simple kind of downstream task. So basically, you can conceptualize all of any model as that. It's kind of finding features and then doing something else with those features. So basically, the question is, okay, who can find good features? Like, how do we find good features? And a difference, this is, I think, a very fundamental thing, is that when you see the progress of vision science, it's vision kind of computational modeling of vision, you have all of these kind of explicit models that kind of leverage what we think the human brain does. And then you have CNNs or deep CNNs that are not as explicit. We just use the architecture because we know it worked for us in our infrastructure. And now we're kind of switching to saying, okay, I don't really care what works well when run on the brain hardware. I just want a general learning thing that works well in the actual hardware we're going to use. So the transformer is great for that. It works with sequences, it works with tokens, anything can be tokenized. I talked to some people that work in some of the frontier labs and stuff like that, and they kind of all agree that the multimodal, just VLLM, you're not going to say that text models will eat everything up. It's just going to be one big model that uses everything. And my guess would be that there's going to be like a couple of really gigantic models, and most other people will just be using those features for other stuff. Okay.
What a bright future. Anyway, okay, any final comments or questions?
I do think it's quite a bright future, because you have the learning of you have a space that's very interesting to have, and the downstream tasks are very interesting. We don't have to all do the same. I think that's been the history of neural networks for the last 15 years. I'm sorry, I'll just give one more example, but when word2vec was, I don't know if you're familiar with word2vec, but the name is pretty descriptive. Word to vector. It's it was made within Google. They had all of these different tasks, and it's what happens if we pull all of our resources to make a good word2vec model, and then each team can use it, one for spam, one for search, one for another thing, and for another. And that allows you to have a very, very smart big model. for which everyone is kind of happy to have access to. So I don't think it's that grim, but there's lots of space still for like specialized networks for like astrophysics and stuff that is not in the training data as much.
Yeah,
Okay, I think I'll just
yeah, well,
end.
maybe we need a debate as to whether we're faced with a grim debate or not, with a grim future. Anyway, all right, I guess that's it. So you guys are free to go. Thank you very much. Let's hand it away.